Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to tonight's stream where we will be interpreting the birth chart of spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle. So I will be first giving my interpretation of his chart, and then in the second half of this stream, I would also like to look more specifically at the time of his awakening, the time of his spiritual awakening, which we know, at least from what we have heard from him, was soon after he turned 29. So one moment, please. Gonna get this shared to Twitter real quick. So I'm hoping that we can get all of this done within an hour or so, but I'm also not sure that we get it done that soon. So we'll see what happens. All right, looking at the birth chart of Eckhart Tolle. There we go. Let's tweak that. Okay, so let us begin. So if you don't know who Eckhart Tolle is, he is a spiritual teacher, sort of new agey spiritual teacher, I suppose. He just had his birthday on February 16th, which I wanted to do this stream a little bit sooner, but things didn't go that way. So we are doing it now instead. And which I don't have it in front of me, but I think he turned 72, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. We'll look at it later. But yes, basically he's a very well-known spiritual teacher. For many years now, he changed a lot of people's lives, and I really like his teachings because, among other reasons, unlike so much of the stuff that we see in like the modern New Age community, with Eckhart Tolle, there is this great emphasis on accepting what is. So he kind of does a 180 on the usual like New Age concepts that are so often seemingly about like escaping reality and trying to avoid reality in some way. Instead, Eckhart Tolle, his teachings are all about accepting the here and now, accepting reality. Now, to get a bit more in depth into this, there is an argument that I've heard that goes something like you can still use this practice of being present, of only focusing on the present moment, as a way to also escape reality, escape yourself. And I suppose there may be some truth to that, because if you, I guess it depends on how you define it, which is difficult to define it for perhaps reasons we'll get into. But if you're going to say that being present simply means focusing on this very moment, and you only ever do that, then it's unlikely that issues that need to be faced and integrated and all of that will arise. Like if you're saying, oh, I'm just going to focus on what's happening now, like happening around me and stuff like that. But the interesting thing is, see, I've read Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now, or I've read nearly all of it at this point. And he's really not teaching that. He's saying whatever arises in the outer world or within, accept. But, maybe we can get into more of that later. I'm just wanting to give sort of an overview here. of things, just saying that I do like his teachings. But so I have right here, you need to be careful not to bump the webcam. I have The Power of Now, his most famous book, the one that really, like, he's most well known for and really took off for him in a powerful way. And for the longest time, I didn't have a physical copy, but I just got one recently, actually, and been reading it. It's quite delightful. Now, to expand on this a bit more, I just want to say I do not live by all the teachings in this book. I do not necessarily almost even agree with all the teachings in this book. But really, what I'm saying is not that I think that they're wrong or bad, just that many of them, if not most of them, are not for me personally, or it's not something that I would live by purely as that being my only philosophy. Instead, what I have found throughout my time reading this magnificent book, The Power of Now, is that when I integrate what I am reading in this book, like being present and different ways of sort of being present and making peace with things, when I integrate that into everything else I'm already about, then it is highly beneficial, and that is what works for me. Now, that's not going to be the case for everyone, obviously, but that's what I do. That's how I use this book. So, I'm sure a lot of people, especially if you're familiar with some of my views and my at times outspoken nature, you might be like, what are you even doing reading a book like that, The Power of Now? You don't seem to be very surrendered or anything. And I say, yes, I know. I'm not claiming to be surrendered. I'm not claiming to have transcended my ego. I'm not claiming any of that. But what I will tell you is the freaking truth, that since I discovered this practice or idea or whatever of being present now about 2.5 years ago, I don't think a day has gone by in my life that I have not practiced being present at least once, that I have not practiced the teachings in this book from Eckhart Tolle, whose birth chart we will be analyzing shortly, at least once a day. And I continue to do that to this very day. So I don't live entirely by the teachings in this book, not even close, but I do integrate many of them into like everything else that I'm all about. So with all of that said, let's dive in, and we'll be taking a bit of a closer look at this book later on. But for now, I just wanted to kind of introduce it. I also want to say, for anyone out there, I want to say this right here, right now. The Power of Now has probably been the single most life-changing book I have ever read in my entire life. And I've been exposed to a pretty fair amount, a pretty good amount of spiritual teachings by now, at this point in my life. And I don't think anything has been as beneficial as The Power of Now, or maybe some things come close. But as far as books go, it's been the most life-changing, powerful, positive book I've ever read. And so I want to say that it's really a book that is for those who are just completely fed up with suffering. And so if there's anyone who watches this, who is watching right now, or who watches this in the future when it's not live, who feels like you're just suffering so much and you're also just so done with suffering, if you're seriously done with suffering, if you really mean it, get The Power of Now. It's only like $10 or something on Amazon. Last I checked, it's not that expensive. And hell, it's even, you can find like free audio versions of it on YouTube. Last I checked. So you don't even have to spend any money. If you have an internet connection, you can just listen to it. Like, please just check that stuff out. If you're feeling, like you're just at the end of your road or whatever, it just may be the book that saves you from the dark, saves you from the endless abyss. So with all of that said and out of the way, let's dive into the chart. I have it here on my tablet. Yes, we are already 10 minutes in, but I wanted to give a good introduction as usual to a sort of contextual introduction of like what we're looking at and everything. And the person we're looking at, person whose chart we're looking at. So let's see, I literally have 6 different charts that I'm going to want to share with you all tonight, but we're going to first start, of course, with the most basic, most fundamental, Eckhart Tolle's birth chart. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a birth time, so I'm not going to know his rising sign. I'm not going to know the ruler of his ascendant. I'm not going to know sect. I'm not going to know the houses, these various things. I looked online and apparently no one knows his birth time. So we don't have access to that information. However, we still have planets, we still have signs, and we still have aspects. We also still have techniques like secondary progressions and solar arcs that we'll be looking at later to make some further determinations. So what we have here then is an Aries rising chart, or a 0 degree Aries chart, since we don't know the ascendant. And this is basically what his chart looks like. Okay, and also, as you can see here, he was born in, not quite sure how to say it, Lunen, Germany? I don't know. He was born in Germany. I'll show it on screen in a moment. February 16th, 1948, on a Monday, day of the moon, ruled by the moon. And obviously we're using the tropical zodiac, so let's just, I'll show this here real quick as well. Tropical zodiac, 0 degrees Aries, because we do not have a birth time. And so I just put 12 p.m. to approximate it. All right, so let us dive in. I'm going to start with the basics, sun and moon, and then we're just going to go through the planets and the aspects and go from there. So, as you saw when I held the chart up to the screen, Eckhart Tolle is an Aquarius sun and a Taurus moon. Aquarius sun, detached, intellectual, perhaps unpredictable. The interesting thing with trying to define an Aquarius is that they're all different. They're all unique. They are the sign of uniqueness, of unpredictability. You can't really pin down Aquarius. Well, you sort of can, but you sort of cannot, because they're all unique. Interestingly enough, however, considering Eckhart Tolle's awakening, Aquarius is already a detached sign, or tends to be a much more intellectually detached sign. Now, Eckhart Tolle's whole awakening was, of course, all about the transcendence of the mind, the transcendence of the intellect, but still, the detachment of being present, I think, still has some kind of parallel, or perhaps some relation to the detachment one can have through the intellect, sort of detaching from things and just viewing things very objectively. So Aquarius sun, and of course ruled by Uranus, the great awakener. Moon, he has his moon in Taurus. Now, we don't know if it's like 1 degree of Taurus or if it is 13 degrees of Taurus or anywhere in between. We just know that we know that it's somewhere between those degrees, approximately 1 to 13 degrees of Taurus, because we don't know the birth time, but we do know it is in the sign of Taurus. Same moon sign as me, funny enough, for those who want to know. So again, this is extremely interesting considering Eckhart Tolle's path in life, because moon in Taurus, first of all, it's in the sign of its exaltation. The moon loves being in Taurus because Taurus is all about stability. The moon does very well in Taurus. Moon in Taurus is a seeker of peace, someone who likes simplicity, stability, and peace. And I think it is quite clear from Eckhart Tolle's teachings that he is someone who is very much all about simple peace. Like that Taurus moon shows in him very, very clearly, if you ask me. All right, so moving on then, just sort of going through the order of the planets. Mercury, he has Mercury retrograde in Pisces. I love it. Mercury is, of course, the mind. Now, Mercury is technically in its fall in Pisces, does not do very well in Pisces, but for Eckhart Tolle, it fits just so appropriately. It's almost silly. Pisces is the sign of the spiritual, mystical, non-physical realms. Pisces is kind of the antithesis of Mercury, and that may be more of a literal statement than we suspect. Mercury wants to think things through logically. Pisces is all emotional and imaginative and spiritual and belief focused, whereas Mercury is more like data focused. So I just think that's so incredibly appropriate when his teachings are all about transcending the mind and entering into the spiritual dimension, that the planet that represents the mind, Mercury, he has in Pisces, a sign all about the spiritual dimension. And it's also retrograde for that matter. So there you have it. Moving on to his Venus. I also really love this one. Geez, you can't make this stuff up. He has Venus at 5 Aries 35. So Venus in Aries. Venus is what we love. Aries is all about now, impulsivity, immediacy, that sort of thing. Some other things too, but what we want to really focus on here is the now, the impulsiveness of Aries. Thus, we have Venus, love of Aries, the now. He literally has a love of the now. Which I'm just going to show that on screen briefly again. It's almost like it's so fitting. It's almost like hard to believe. And so I want to show it again. Okay. Mars. He has Mars at 28 of Leo. So I could talk for a bit about Mars and Leo being rather aggressive, impulsive. Mars really wants to push forward in a powerful way and assert itself in a powerful way in Leo, which that gets into some other things. But I think for the sake of time, what is really most significant here and so striking to me when I first saw this chart is that Leo Mars also has Saturn and Pluto there with it. So if we just looked at this chart traditionally, in traditional astrology, the two quote unquote bad planets, the two malefics, Mars and Saturn, they are both there in the same sign for Eckhart Tolle, Leo. Add in the modern planet of Pluto, which astronomically is no longer a planet, but astrologically basically still is. And we also have another extremely difficult planet there in the same sign. So he has in the sign of Leo a recipe for disaster. But don't misunderstand. Again, there is much here that really needs to be explained if you're new to this, but I'm going to have to try to sum it up for the sake of time. Very simply put, we incarnate into these bodies with the intention of meeting very specific challenges, not to torture ourselves, but so that we can learn and grow for the purpose of facilitating our further growth and development. I hope I said that accurately. We have to move on. So Mars, Saturn, Pluto, all there in Leo, extremely challenging. And this ties into his awakening in very specific, key, interesting ways that we'll look into when we get to that part. All right, so Jupiter. Now, for some positivity, he has Jupiter, not surprisingly, in its home sign of Sagittarius. And so his Jupiter does very well. The great optimism and idealism and beliefs and the idea of gaining knowledge, although ultimately he's not so much about knowledge as he is about the transcendent dimension. Jupiter, ruling Sagittarius, also rules Pisces, the sign, as I mentioned earlier, of the transcendent dimension. So that placement there is not surprising. Saturn in Leo, we already mentioned and went over. Uranus, he has in Gemini, Uranus, the Great Awakener. Uranus in Gemini is just that much more Uranian, that very electric, very mental, very perceptive, very intense. We'll get more into what's truly relevant in this chart for that later, and also a little more here in a bit. Neptune, Neptune, the planet of the transcendent spiritual dimension. He has in Libra at 12 Libra 42. So as we're getting to these, outermost of the outer planets, it's becoming almost less relevant what sign they're in, and it's going to become more relevant what aspects have been made to them through like transits and progressions and all that, which we'll get into. But Neptune in Libra, let's consider it briefly. Neptune, as I mentioned, is the spiritual planet of the transcendent realms and all that. Libra is harmony seeking, peace seeking. It is balanced. It is beautiful. It is all of those, harmonious things that being in a state of enlightenment is very often associated with, to say the least. And then, of course, is Pluto. We already mentioned in Leo. Going to take a sip of water, and then we're going to look at his nodal axis and then his Chiron. Nodal axis. He has his north node at 18 of Taurus. And so again, we have this Taurian idea, or ideal, I guess, either one works, of peace and simplicity. And so the north node is thought to be what we must creatively work towards in a given life. Something that's not going to come automatically, but we must sort of work towards it. It is also thought then to be connected with our life purpose. Well, it's like saying he must work towards or his life purpose is all about that Taurian peace and simplicity. And thus we have his teachings being very much like that. Also, I want to say in connection with this that when you look at Eckhart Tolle's teachings, like if you read The Power of Now, for example, they are very simple. There isn't a whole lot of stuff about like endless lists of techniques and technical ways of transcending and all this stuff. That's more, in fact, he's like kind of against that in terms of his teachings. That's like mind stuff. He's all about this simplicity, a simple enlightenment, and thus North Node in Taurus. Now, his South Node, he has at 18 of Scorpio, and his Chiron, Wounded Healer Chiron, at 24 of Scorpio. So I was looking at this before this stream and thought a couple different things. So the South Node is said to be what we automatically emanate and put out into the world, what we don't have to work to do, what just automatically comes from us. Chiron, of course, is all about the healing of wounds. His Chiron and South Node they're 6 degrees apart, but many astrologers would consider that a conjunction. And I personally, well, I don't know if I'd consider it a conjunction or not, but basically I would say it might as well be a conjunction, because just the fact that they're in the same sign in the first place is going to have them interacting significantly, in my opinion. And it's in the sign of Scorpio, deep, dark, passionate, complex. And so my theory on this is that Eckhart Tolle automatically, at least once he had his awakening and entered this great state of presence that he was in, I guess, nearly all the time, if not all the time, virtually all the time, perhaps. Once that happened, he automatically emanated this healing energy out into the world. And in Scorpio, well, healing of some of the deepest, darkest stuff that we can face, I would say. Now, full disclosure here, I'm not 100% sure about this theory. I mean, really, all of this is just a theory, ultimately, if you want to get right down to it. This is just my interpretation. Other people might have a completely different interpretation, but this is one area where I'm really a little bit less sure of, and I would be interested to hear what other astrologers think of this particular section of his chart, but that would be my interpretation of that. All right, so next we shall look at the aspects. All right, let's see here. So, a couple of interesting things here. First of all, his Aquarius sun that we went over earlier, I guess we went over all these points by now, is in a powerful trine with his Uranus in Gemini. And again, Uranus is the great awakener. And so already from birth, he was, I would say, energetically, astrologically predisposed to this great awakening energy of Uranus. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to manifest in every second of his life. And from what he says of his life story or whatever, apparently that's, not indeed not what happened. It didn't manifest until soon after his 29th birthday, he says. But that's the thing. When we're looking, it's by the way, when we're looking at a birth chart in astrology, the idea is not that every single aspect manifests at every single second of a person's life. I mean, of course not. When you think about that, that's absurd. There is instead an element of timing involved with these things. Also, hello there, Ryan. Good to see you here. Welcome to the stream. Hope you're doing well. So, yes, indeed. He has that powerful Sun-Uranus trine, just predisposing him from birth to a powerful spiritual awakening. And that is, of course, what he eventually ended up seeing. That Aquarius sun is also in a supportive sextile with Jupiter in Sagittarius. Jupiter, the optimism, the idealism, the beliefs, the idea that we can overcome our obstacles and stuff like that. So that's, of course, adding positivity. Jupiter, also the ruler of Pisces, the sign of spiritual transcendence, where again, Eckhart Tolle has his Mercury. Let's see. Interestingly enough, his sun is also square his Chiron, indicating a challenging aspect between the two of them. So the sun is literally thought to be our ego or sense of self. So literally the ego versus the healing of wounds. Doesn't get much more appropriate than that for Eckhart Tolle. Built right into his chart. Let's see, well, I have employment, so I'm doing better. Thank you for asking. Oh, that's awesome, Ryan. I am glad to hear that. Congratulations. Sounds like things are looking up for you. That's that's just excellent to hear. All right, so that's what we have with his son. Now, looking at his Taurus moon real quick. So, indeed, we don't have a birth time, and so we don't know the exact degree of the moon. However, we do know that it is square to all of that difficult Leo stuff by sign, and it is almost certainly like 99.9% chance applying to squares to all of that Leo stuff, Pluto, Saturn, Mars, which I'm just going to show here on screen again because that is very intense. Oh, you started on my vlog today, Ryan? Oh, thank you. My latest one. Yeah, that's a fairly intense one. Oh, good. I'm glad to know that that message is being heard, I suppose. Yeah, thank you very much. Hope you enjoy it. So, moon applying to squares to that difficult Leo stuff. Obviously, that's going to predispose him to more challenges in that area, but specifically, that's going to challenge his Taurus moon desire for peace and simplicity. And I almost want to say I can speak of this from experience, or I can speak from experience about this, having a Taurus moon myself. But of course, I don't have the same configuration he has with those squares. But I know just for myself, my like desire slash need, especially for stability, I would say peace as well, but especially for stability, is so strong that some of probably the most traumatic thing for me is to have that peace disturbed in whatever way that could happen. And so I don't know if this is for sure what happened with Eckhart Tolle prior to his awakening, but there almost seems to be an implication here of perhaps the reason that his life was so traumatic prior to his awakening being that his peace that he wanted so badly was regularly extremely disturbed. Like he was perhaps, I would say, deeply tormented in such a way that it wrecked any state of peace that he might have or stability that he might gain, I suppose. But again, I'm just speculating. I don't know for sure about that. That would be sort of my astrological theory, though. Definitely not an easy aspect. All right, so looking at his Jupiter for a moment, as I mentioned, of course, his Aquarius sun and a supportive sextile with his Jupiter. That Jupiter is also trining all of that difficult Leo stuff. And so here another dimension of his chart opens up where we have, yes, all of the difficult negative energy of the Leo realm in his chart, but we have Jupiter at least bringing its optimism and its idealism, its positivity, its sort of softened energy, especially through that trine, to the difficult Leo stuff. And I think that probably plays into the idea of his awakening as well, because remember, Jupiter, we're using traditional astrology here, or I'm using it so much of the time. Jupiter traditionally rules Pisces, the sign of spiritual transcendence. And thus, Jupiter trining all of that difficult, traumatic Leo stuff that Eckhart Tolle has is reflecting, I would say, that spiritual transcendence of the difficult placements there. Mars, Saturn, and Pluto all congregated in Leo. So that's very interesting as well. On the flip side, though, I have to say that just because it's a trine doesn't mean it's always going to be positive. And Jupiter powerfully connecting with that stuff in Leo could have just been amplifying the negativity of it many times as well in Eckhart Tolle's life, especially, I would say, in his early life prior to his awakening, of course. So just magnifying the arduousness, the trauma, the forlorn, depressing hopelessness of things. And like the bleak torment and vile separation, I would say. And I mean, again, think about this. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's really very simple when you think about it. In a given life, how can you have a spiritual transcendence if you don't first have something deeply traumatic to transcend in the first place? And, I'm coming at this through astrology. Eckhart Tolle's coming at it through his spiritual transcendent state. And yet we both definitely would agree on this point, that there has to be something to or it's not even so much that, but it's more specifically, that the greater the amount of suffering, the greater the desire, and thus therefore probability for transcendence. Now, that doesn't always mean, though, that those who suffer the most are going to be those who transcend the most, because it's not that simple. And I, as an astrologer, would say it's not that simple because everyone's energetic configuration is different, as we can see in their charts. I'm not sure what Eckhart Tolle would say about that, but I mean, he's probably observed the same. But what I'm saying, though, is with great challenges come great opportunities for transcendence of those challenges. In other words, in the words of the great Otep Shemaiah, your suffering will free you. All right, so let's see what else we have here. See, we went over all of that stuff. Oh, also, interestingly enough, he has a Jupiter-Uranus opposition, just amplifying Jupiter, that tendency for a great awakening, Uranus. I also want to say that with his sun being in Aquarius, a Uranus-ruled sign in modern astrology, because again, I'm using both modern and ancient or traditional or whatever, with his sun being in a Uranus-ruled sign and then trine to Uranus itself, well, of course, Uranus is also very much the sign of, or the planet of uniqueness and individuality, being completely different, being highly unusual, and that's sort of connected in many ways with it being known as the Great Awakener. And thus, we, of course, have someone like Eckhart Tolle who, in his awakened state, is very different. He's not your everyday person. He might not appear all that different or unique on the surface, but his way of being is extremely unique and different. Welcome back, Ryan. Good to see you back here. All right. So we have that. Are there any other aspects that we should go over before we move on? Yes, there are. Interestingly enough, that Chiron at 24 of Scorpio is also square to that difficult Leo stuff, the Pluto, Saturn, and Mars. And so again, just connecting this need to heal wounds with all of that rather traumatic, if we're being honest, Leo placements with Pluto, Saturn, and Mars. So that sort of inner conflict, which that sort of pressure eventually leading to an awakening, sort of already been over this, but just want to mention that as it is quite powerful and intense in his chart. Now, it is true, some might want to point out, oh, he has a Neptune-Pluto sextile. Well, everyone has a Neptune-Pluto sextile that was born in the last, I don't even know how many years, 100 years or nearly so. But yes, for someone like Eckhart Tolle, it might be particularly more significant. And there is some stuff with that, but I'm going to save that for later because that is when it gets more significant or more interesting, I would say. All right, so you talked about a sun square Chiron, sun trine Uranus. His Venus is opposite his Neptune as well, interestingly enough, applying to an opposition to his Neptune. And so maybe some potential there for getting a little too carried away with the Neptunian realms, but I don't know. He seems to have it under control, in my opinion, from what I've seen and observed. All right, so I would say that's about it for his natal chart. For summarizing it, at least, I mean, one could talk endlessly even just about this information, what we have here. But what I also want to go over, of course, in this stream, as I mentioned earlier, is a special emphasis on the astrology of the time of his awakening, because we may not have an exact date for the time of his awakening, but he says in his book it was soon after his 29th birthday. And so what I did is I cast some charts, transits, secondary progressions, solar arcs, for March 1st, following his 29th birthday. So it may not be exact, but it should be in the ballpark. And I have them here, which, let's see, let me just show a little bit here to give you an idea of what I am talking about. Let's see. Just get the secondary progress chart. Okay. This is the, wait a second. Camera is looking a little off for some reason. Did I bump it? I don't know, but this is the secondary progress chart. And of course, again, because we don't have a birth time, the position of the moon in this chart will not really be relevant. And, or I guess I should say, however, once we get to even just the sun, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, those will be quite relevant, and we'll be looking at those soon enough. For a second, I thought my screen froze. LOL. Oh no. Yeah, you know what I'd really like to do is be able to just show the charts on screen, like digitally, like directly, without having to show them on my laptop, and then have me like in a small window in the corner. But I would need a at least slightly more powerful computer to do that, because believe me, I've already tried and it doesn't work with my computer. But maybe one day we can look forward to streams like that. Anyway, what I want to do next is, as I mentioned, I want to give a special focus to this time of Eckhart Tolle's awakening, which had happened all at once for him. Okay, it happened late one night, and what I'm actually going to do for this, because you see, this is how we learn astrology, is we look at actual real life examples, and then look at the reflections in the astrology. What I want to do is look at the account he gives in The Power of Now itself. I'm going to read his brief retelling of his awakening experience, to really give those watching now and in the future a much better idea of just what this was like for him. And then we're going to look at the astrology of it. So it should be very interesting. All right, let's see. My main computer is an inexpensive Chromebook, so I know how you feel. Yes. Yeah, that's still pretty cool though. Chromebook, those look cool. They at least seem rather stylish, you know, or sleek and all that. So that's nice. But yeah, my computer is definitely can do the basics easily enough, but cannot do much beyond that. All right, so here we go. This is at the very beginning of The Power of Now. Again, if you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling like you're just absolutely fed up with suffering and you really want some kind of transformation and you might be open to this kind of stuff, I highly recommend this book. But as I said earlier, even for me, like, I don't use everything in this book, or I don't live fully by the teachings in this book, because they're not all for me, but instead I integrate some of them into my life, the ones that do work for me, and it's been very helpful. Anyway, here we go. Wish there was an easier way I could do this. Actually, I wonder if, hang on one second. There we go. I've moved the microphone slightly so I don't have to hold this book awkwardly. Okay, here we go. The origin of this book. I have little use for the past and rarely think about it. However, I would briefly like to tell you how I came to be a spiritual teacher and how this book came into existence. Until my 30th year, I lived in a state of almost continuous anxiety, interspersed with periods of suicidal depression. It feels now as if I am talking about some past lifetime or somebody else's life. One night, not long after my 29th birthday, there we have the astrological data that we need, I woke up in the early hours with a feeling of absolute dread. I had woken up with such a feeling many times before, but this time it was more intense than it had ever been. The silence of the night, the vague outlines of the furniture in the dark room, the distant noise of a passing train, everything felt so alien, so hostile, and so utterly meaningless that it created in me a deep loathing of the world. The most loathsome thing of all, however, was my own existence. What was the point in continuing to live with this burden of misery? Why carry on with this continuous struggle? I could feel that a deep longing for annihilation, for non-existence, was now becoming much stronger than the instinctive desire to continue to live. I cannot live with myself any longer. This was the thought that kept repeating itself in my mind. Then suddenly I became aware of what a peculiar thought it was. Am I one or two? If I cannot live with myself, there must be two of me, the I and the self that I cannot live with. Maybe, I thought, only one of them is real. I was so stunned by the strange realization that my mind stopped. I was fully conscious, but there were no more thoughts. Then I felt drawn into what seemed like a vortex of energy. It was a slow movement at first and then accelerated. I was gripped by an intense fear, and my body started to shake. I heard the words, "resist nothing," as if spoken inside my chest. I could feel myself being sucked into a void. It felt as if the void was inside myself rather than outside. Suddenly, there was no more fear, and I let myself fall into that void. I have no recollection of what happened after that. I was awakened by the chirping of a bird outside the window. I had never heard such a sound before. My eyes were still closed, and I saw the image of a precious diamond. Yes, if a diamond could make a sound, this is what it would be like. I opened my eyes. The first light of dawn was filtering through the curtains. Without any thought, I knew that there is infinitely more to life than we realize, or light than we realize. That soft luminosity filtering through the curtains was love itself. Tears came into my eyes. I got up and walked around the room. I recognized the room, and yet I knew that I had never truly seen it before. Everything was fresh and pristine, as if it had just come into existence. I picked up things, a pencil, an empty bottle, marveling at the beauty and aliveness of it all. That day I walked around the city in utter amazement at the miracle of life on earth, as if I had just been born into this world. For the next 5 months, I lived in a state of uninterrupted deep peace and bliss. After that, it diminished somewhat in intensity, or perhaps it just seemed to because it became my natural state. I could still function in the world, although I realized that nothing I ever did could possibly add anything to what I already had. I knew, of course, that something profoundly significant had happened to me, but I didn't understand it at all. It wasn't until several years later, after I had read spiritual texts and spent time with spiritual teachers, that I realized that what everybody was looking for had already happened to me. I understood that the intense pressure of suffering that night must have forced my consciousness to withdraw from its identification with the unhappy and deeply fearful self, which is ultimately a fiction of the mind. This withdrawal must have been so complete that this false, suffering self immediately collapsed, just as if a plug had been pulled out of an inflatable toy. What was left then was my true nature as the ever-present I am, consciousness in its pure state prior to identification with form. Later, I also learned to go into that inner timeless and deathless realm that I had originally perceived as a void and remain fully conscious. I dwelt in states of such indescribable bliss and sacredness that even the original experience I just described pales in comparison. A time came when, for a while, I was left with nothing on the physical plane. I had no relationships, no job, no home, no socially defined identity. I spent almost 2 years sitting on park benches in a state of the most intense joy. But even the most beautiful experiences come and go. More fundamental, perhaps, than any experience is the undercurrent of peace that has never left me since then. Sometimes it is very strong, almost palpable, and others can feel it too. At other times, it is somewhere in the background, like a distant melody. Later, people would occasionally come up to me and say, "I want what you have. Can you give it to me or show me how to get it?" And I would say, "You have it already. You just can't feel it because your mind is making too much noise." That answer later grew into the book that you are holding in your hands. Before I knew it, I had an external identity again. I had become a spiritual teacher. And that is the story of Eckhart Tolle's awakening from the power of now. So, so let me move my micro back in place first. So one might wonder, after having heard something like that, so profound, so inspiring, so spiritual and amazing, at least if one is at all interested in astrology, what on earth must the astrological conditions have been like at that time, both transit wise, like where were the planets at that moment, or at least in that general time period, and also for Eckhart Tolle himself, what did his progressions look like? What did his solar arcs look like? Well, we're going to look at all of that right now. I've also, of course, heard the theory before that this idea that does someone who has transcended in this way, someone who has entered this spiritual transcendence, are they also then transcending their astrological chart? Are they transcending all of their astrological stuff? I'm going to say that while I don't think anyone can know the answer to that question for sure, I'm going to say no, or at least that would be my strongest theory, because all you have to do is look in astrology at the planet Neptune, for example, to see a representative of that spiritual transcendent dimension. I am convinced, after having spent years studying astrology, that that literally every kind of experience a human can have is mapped, or at the very least mappable, through astrology, even highly transcendent ones. Because you still, I don't know, I guess it's like you still have to admit, even if you're connecting with something that is far beyond the human realm, you're still doing that from a human body and like from a human brain. Like even if you're sort of entering into something that's beyond all that, you're still locked in, at least on some level, are you not, to your body, your brain, and all of that. So, but anyway, as I mentioned, we want to look at a couple different things here. Let's see, what should we look at first, actually? Maybe the transits would be of the most relevance. So where are those? So I think I was going to originally get the transit chart, or a chart of the transits around that time on its own, but instead I just have a bi-wheel, but oh well. Let's see here. All right, so we're going to look at a bi-wheel here. If you don't know what that is, you'll find out soon enough. It's pretty simple to understand. It's basically like a chart that contains two charts, where the outer wheel is one chart and the inner wheel is another. For this, the outer wheel shows the transits for March 1st, soon after Eckhart Tolle's 29th birthday. So again, it's like the moon is not really going to be relevant at all, because we can't say that, that's accurate. The sun may be somewhat relevant. Mercury and Venus may be somewhat relevant. Mars starts to get a little more relevant. And then Jupiter on out remains relatively unaffected, or at least theoretically pretty much unaffected. And then, of course, the inner wheel here is his birth chart. So take a look. Take a look. So, notice anything powerful yet? Well, whether you do or you don't, I'm about to point such things out to you. So I went over this earlier before the stream, but let me just scan it again briefly. So first of all, Eckhart Tolle, of course, I mean, we wouldn't even need this chart to know this, but just to get it out of the way, he was indeed at this time having his Saturn return, as basically everyone does at/around 29 years of age. You can see that transiting Saturn was retrograde at the time and very close to his natal Saturn, which basically, as far as a Saturn return goes, what I've figured out at this point is as soon as Saturn enters the same sign as your natal Saturn, you're having a Saturn return. I don't care if your Saturn is at 2959 of, say, Sagittarius. As soon as transiting Saturn enters 0 degrees 1 minute of Sagittarius, your Saturn return has begun. That is what I've seen in my own experience and in that of others. So, yeah, he was having a Saturn return here, which I want to sort of focus in on that part of the chart real quick as well. Let's see. And of course, as you can also see, his Saturn was extremely close to Pluto at the time. Powerful, transformative Pluto. And so that was certainly, not mitigating anything at that time. Let me check something on my monitor real quick. Okay. Make sure I had the brightness where it should be. Pluto, anytime Pluto is involved, things just go to extremes, or like virtually always anyway, like 99.9% of the time. If Pluto's involved, it's going to take that stuff and it's going to push it to just like ridiculous extremes. And so, he was in the grips of that at that time. No wonder that was when he experienced awakening. However, speaking of Pluto, we also have Pluto, transiting Pluto, being over his Neptune at this time. Now, yes, it is true that with something of this nature, this is something that anyone his age was experiencing at this time. Anyone born even just a couple years before, up to a couple years after him, more or less, and especially if they were born like within a year that he was born, like within 1 year of his birthday. But it's so interesting because, of course, Pluto is transformation and, powerful experiences and all this stuff, extremes. And again, Neptune is the planet of the transcendent dimension. And whenever we have conjunctions like this, conjunctions are the most powerful aspect of all. Conjunctions tell the story like nothing else. When there's a conjunction, you can be virtually guaranteed that something powerful is going to happen. And thus, that's what happened with Eckhart Tolle. All right, let's see what else we have here. I'll just mention this briefly. Interestingly enough, Uranus, the Great Awakener, transiting Uranus, that is, was in Scorpio at the time at 11 of Scorpio, the same sign as his natal Chiron at 24 of Scorpio, and South Node at 18 of Scorpio, for that matter. So Uranus being the Great Awakener, Chiron being the Wounded Healer, Scorpio, deep, dark, and intense. There you have it. For what it's worth, Neptune was at 16 of Sagittarius. His natal Jupiter, the ruler of Pisces, the sign of the transcendent dimension, is at 23 of Sagittarius, and so Neptune was, it was still quite a ways from being exact, of course, and this probably isn't ultimately all that significant, but just for the hell of it, since it is Neptune, it was technically applying to a conjunction, though it would still be many years from then, to his Neptune, but still same sign and all that, mentioning it for what it may be worth. All right, let's see. Now, kind of hesitate to mention this because if the date is off, then this does not apply. But let's say for a moment that his awakening really indeed did happen right around March 1st. Then transiting Mercury, the planet of the mind, was over his Aquarius sun. Mercury being on March 1st at 28 of Aquarius, his sun being at 26 of Aquarius. And so an event involving his ego and his mind, well, that is indeed what happened. But again, we don't know the exact date, so we can't be completely sure of that. Turning down the heat. I tend to get warm when I live stream. Must be all the energy flowing through me or something. Or I get warm eventually. All right. Now, also, interestingly enough, again, as long as this wasn't like several months off or something, as long as it was correct within hopefully a month, maybe a couple weeks or so, he was experiencing a Venus return at this time because March 1st, transiting Venus was at 20 of Aries. His natal Venus is at 5 of Aries. And again, as I mentioned in the first part of the stream, my interpretation of his Venus in Aries is Venus, love of Aries, the now, a love of the now, the power of now. Now, it is true that everyone experiences a Venus return about once a year, but just the fact that it was highly likely that he was experiencing his Venus return for that year around the time of his awakening, and it's Venus in Aries, I think is interesting and significant. All right, so we could, of course, look deeper and deeper and deeper into the transits, but those are the most important ones, I would say, and so we're going to move on. I just want to reiterate, though, before we do, I suppose, about the idea of the Saturn return. The Saturn return is when the shit hits the fan, as they say, to use a saying that's been around for, I guess, a little while now, at least. The Saturn return is where you really run into reality. And if you've already been living a very difficult life, your Saturn return may very well, I would say in many cases anyway, from what I've observed, will be that much more difficult, especially if your life has been difficult because you haven't been dealing with reality effectively. Now, I don't know what the case with Eckhart Tolle was in those times, but regardless, the Saturn return usually is a rough time for everyone. It's easier for those with day charts, which leads me to think that maybe Eckhart Tolle has a night chart. So maybe that could help us narrow down his ascendant. He probably has a night chart where the sun is below the ascendant-descendant axis. The Saturn return then is also, it's more difficult for those who've not been dealing with reality. Conversely, it's easier for those who have been dealing responsibly with reality. But the interesting thing also about this Saturn return connection to Eckhart Tolle's awakening and his subsequent teachings is this idea of stillness. Eckhart Tolle's teachings are all about stillness. And I mean, you can look at right at the etymology of the word still, any word like that with an ST, or virtually any word like that, any word I've ever heard with an ST like that, is a Saturn word, which is weird because it's this whole idea of Saturn having the S and the T, Saturn, and even the symbol of Saturn looks very much like sort of an S mixed with a T. Literally, words like that are Saturnian words. Words like most, best, stable, stairs. Trying to think of some other good ones, which I'm drawing. See, if I wasn't live right now, if I wasn't on the spot, I'd be able to think of many more Saturnian words, but I'm kind of on the spot, so here I am. Stable, strength, stamina. There are some good ones, especially stamina. Stick, stuck, stack. See, ST words. Well, anyway, I'm too on the spot, I guess, to think of more of them, but you get the idea. And so this idea of stillness is a very Saturnian thing. So interesting that it was his Saturn return, Saturnian stillness, when he had his great spiritual awakening. All right, so let us look now at a biwheel of his secondary progressions at the time of his awakening, the approximate time of his awakening, and his natal chart. When dealing with secondary progressions, for the most part, I guess there's different opinions on this, but from what I can see, for the most part, the most relevant things most of the time will be when the progressed planet or object is in an aspect to a natal point. Though I think the exception with that tends to be the moon, if I'm remembering correctly. Very briefly, if you don't understand what secondary progressions are, let me try to explain this. You're basically taking, say, the first year of a person's life and the astrological chart from the first second that the person was born up until 24 hours after they were born, and the astrological movements, minute as they may be, through that chart. And you are applying that in direct proportion to the first year of the person's life. So the chart for the first day becomes the chart for the first year. The chart for the second day becomes a chart for the second year, and so on and so forth. And so for looking at Eckhart Tolle here, he says this was after his 29th birthday, so that was his 30th year. And so the 30th day that he was alive in this incarnation represents the chart for that year. And of course, it's not just like, see, it's so hard to explain this properly. It's not just that you pick like one point in that day, like say day 30 of his life at noon, and then apply that for the entirety of year 30 of his life. Instead, it's proportionate. So like, I don't know. I don't know how else to explain it at this point. It's like it's proportionate, it's analogous. It's like you're changing the time flow. It's like the the movements from the beginning of day 30 to the end of day 30 are assigned to the beginning of year 30 to the end of year 30. So it's a moving chart. Again, that's as clear as I can make it. If you don't get it at this point, um, I understand, because it is complicated, or it can sound confusing, but I don't know how to explain it any better than that, and we're running out of time. All right, so in this chart, we have his secondary progressions as the outer wheel and his natal chart as the inner wheel. So go ahead and burn and observe. All right, and again, we're not really going to be able to do anything with the transiting moon, and even the secondary progressed moon, since we don't have an exact birth time, that could be way off. So I can't do a whole lot with that. So we won't be looking at that. But what do we notice? We notice a couple of things. So let's see. Well, actually, despite what I just said about the moon, we can say this. We can look at this. There was a very good chance that his progressed Venus was over or almost right over his natal moon at this time, interestingly enough. So progressed Venus in Taurus, aligning with his natal moon, possibly bringing great harmony and blessings, those wonderful Venusian blessings to his Taurus moon, his desire for stability and peace and simplicity. So that seems quite appropriate for an awakening, don't you think? Now, let's see. Following that, yeah, this is fascinating. On a more challenging note, his secondary progressed Mars was at this time backing right into, because he was born with a retrograde, his natal Saturn in Leo. And so literally Mars, who wants to go, 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 and then Saturn, the freaking wall, the limit, Mars is banging into the wall, metaphorically speaking, symbolically saying that Eckhart Tolle reached his limit at or around this time. He could go no further with this suffering, and thus there was the breakthrough. And let me just show that real quick, because that's incredible. All right, moving on from that, let us see here. Let's see, was there anything else? His progressed Mercury was over his natal sun at this time. So interesting how we were looking at transiting Mercury earlier, and it also appeared to be over his natal sun, and so it's very interesting indeed. So again, with this idea of Mercury the mind, the sun the ego, and thus an event involving both of them, the two of them. So it's interesting to consider that, like, even if transiting Mercury was not so close to his natal sun at that time, his secondary progressed Mercury sure as hell was. All right. Let me see some things here. Okay. So anyway, I think that's about it for the main points of his secondary progressions. If we had more time, we could look into it further. I'm a bit tempted to be like, let's look deeper into this, but just looking real quick to see if I see anything else. It is interesting to note that his progressed sun was approaching the sign of Aries at this time. Now it was still at 25 Pisces 48. So still had a ways to go. But I don't know. I've seen this pattern in my own life where it seems like once a progressed point gets close to the next house / next sign, that, like, I already start to see some of the changes involved with that next house / sign happening. So I wonder if maybe, getting so close to Aries, again, the sign of now, of do it now and all that, if there wasn't anything connected there, I suppose. How is it so hot in here right now? Just turn the heater even more, I guess. All right, so those are his progressions to natal points at the time of his awakening. Now let us look at his solar arcs. And again, like, yes, we can look at, we can get squares, oppositions, trines, sextiles as well. With secondary progressions, my astrology program seems to think we can even look at quincunxes. But, we kind of just don't have time, I guess, right now. I don't know how to put it any more clearly. If we don't, unless we want this presentation to be like 3-4 hours long, we just don't have time to go through all that. But if you're really interested in it and you're an astrologer yourself, you can always look that up for yourself and see what interesting stuff you can derive. I was looking all through this before I did this stream earlier tonight as I was preparing for it. And I was discovering all kinds of stuff that wasn't just conjunctions. I was discovering all kinds of stuff through looking at other aspects. So it is fascinating indeed. But anyway, we're going to look at solar arcs now. If you don't know what solar arcs are, to describe them briefly, it's basically where you move all the points in a chart forward. How do I put this accurately? Geez, how do I describe this one accurately? Oh my God. Like, it's similar to secondary progressions, but it's like you move all the points forward about 1 degree for each year of the life. And it's basically linked to the sun. And I don't know if I can describe this properly, but hence the name solar arcs. Oh boy, how do I say this properly? It's like, since the sun moves about 1 degree per day, all the other points in a solar arc chart will have moved that same about 1 degree per day that the sun moved. But it's not exactly precisely 1 degree that the sun moves per day. It is ever so slightly less than 1 degree, because there's 360 degrees in a circle, 365 degrees in a year. So it's ever so slightly less than 1 degree. And so everything else is moved forward by that same amount, unless I'm somehow misunderstanding solar arcs all this time and it's something else, but I don't think it is. But when I say all this time, it's really not that long. I'm actually quite new to these predictive techniques, not transits though. I've been studying those for years. Okay, so anyway, geez, I was hoping to use the 11:05 p.m. electional chart here tonight, but I guess I won't get to because this is going on longer than I expected. Okay, so looking at his solar arc chart for the time of his awakening, which I will show briefly, and then we will behold the conjunctions. Okay. We have, let's see, outer wheel is the solar arc chart, inner wheel is his natal chart. We have, of course, his solar arc Mercury approaching his Venus. So, interestingly enough, Mercury, the mind, Venus, harmony, bringing things together, love and beauty and all of that, and blessings. So, blessings to the mind, interestingly enough. We have his solar arc Venus, possibly in the realm of his moon. And I'll just say this real quick since I just noticed it. In addition to the solar arc Mercury to natal Venus, we also have his solar arc Venus sextiling his natal Mercury. So soft, supportive sextile aspect, even more evidence of that Venus Mercury activity going on. Let's see. We have his solar arc north node approaching his natal Uranus, the great awakener. So life purpose, north node, connecting with Uranus, the great awakener, his awakening. Let's see. I feel like earlier there were some things that were really just blowing me away, but they might have been, non-conjunctions. Well, the next big conjunction that we have is his solar arc Chiron right over his natal Jupiter. That's intense. Chiron, wounded healer, and Jupiter, the ruler of Pisces, the sign of the transcendent realm. Let me just show that on the screen real quick. Yeah, so that's quite interesting. Solar arcs, just for the record, from the research I've done, are thought to be, how do I put this? A little more ego focused, a little more surfacey, and the secondary progressions are thought to be like deeper, more profound, powerful changes. But both are very important. Don't discount solar arcs just because there may be a little more solar. Okay, so let's see. There was something else earlier that just blew my freaking mind about this, and I want to make sure I talk about it before it's too late. Well, interestingly enough, his solar arc Neptune was applying to squares to all of that difficult Pluto, Saturn, Mars stuff in Leo, all that difficult Leo stuff. So squares, of course, difficult aspects. But there was something with his Pluto. Hang on. And of course, it would have to be his solar arc Pluto. Weird. Now, as I'm looking at his chart again, I can't seem to figure out what it was. What the hell was it? It was something, or no, it was Neptune. I think it was something with Neptune and Pluto. Sorry, I don't want to waste anyone's time, but this is too interesting. Let's see, solar arc, Neptune, natal Pluto. Well, okay, yeah, we just went over that. But okay, let's flesh that out a little bit more. We've already gone sort of over the time that I wanted to spend on this, so we'll just go over a bit more. Oh shit! Now I'm bumping the webcam. All right. So here, of course, I have the Book of Pluto that I've been reading and studying for a while now, and well, it's one of the books I've been reading and studying anyway. And in this book, we do have information on solar arc Neptune in hard aspect with natal Pluto. Let me just make sure this is correct. Yeah, okay, check this out. This is what was happening with Eckhart Tolle at the time of his awakening. The moving hard aspects. Spiritually, you are tripping over yourself. That is the warning of the moving square or opposition between Neptune and Pluto. Your Neptunian intuition is attempting to deliver a message, but a wound in your spirit is blocking reception. To receive the message, you must heal the wound. Is your inner image of the universe twisted? Maybe mom smoked cigarettes while you were in her womb. Maybe the amniotic fluid was rendered toxic by the nicotine, and that simple fact built a paradigm into your deepest psychological stratum, a paradigm of a toxic universe. How might that manifest in adult life? All-pervasive fear, mistrust, and foreboding. Under a moving hard aspect here, the time has come to make that unconscious attitude conscious. Why? Because otherwise a message of hope and possibility cannot break through into your awareness. Your quote-unquote God won't let it. If something beat you down when you were young, then under this moving hard aspect, you may find yourself unable to move forward into your true spiritual inheritance because of an unnatural, unnecessary, shame-faced humility. If, on the other hand, something hurt you by inflating your ego when you were young, you were a spoiled child, for example, then this aspect suggests that arrogance or pride may be blinding you. As always, squares and oppositions suggest strong evolutionary pressures and the need for committed effort. Handled consciously, they suggest a breakthrough. In an unconscious scenario, hard aspects between Pluto and Neptune imply that we'll get our karm-uppance, to use Ram Dass's delightful phrase. Our quote-unquote stuff catches up with us, and we find ourselves in painful or embarrassing circumstance of our own creation. This is the season of rectification. So I think it's safe to say that Eckhart Tolle handled his Neptune-Pluto transit quite well, or not transit, but his solar arc Neptune square to his natal Pluto development quite well. He handled that quite well indeed. So let me squeeze this back in here and try not to bump the webcam cord as I do so. All right, so there you have it. Briefly, we could also observe that his solar arc Uranus was applying to a square to his natal Chiron. So Uranus, again, the great awakener, Chiron, the wounded healer, saying there's a lot of tension between awakening, or this Uranian idea of awakening, and the part of him that was wounded, Chiron, the wounded healer, all this stuff. Let's see, anything else? I mean, we could sit here all night and dive deeper and deeper and deeper into these various charts connected with Eckhart Tolle and his awakening. But I think we've gone over the most important stuff here tonight. I will mention one more thing that's interesting about his chart, though, and that is that as far as that Aquarius Leo axis goes, where he has all that difficult Leo stuff, Pluto, Saturn, Mars, his Saturn and his Sun are in mutual reception, meaning that his Saturn in Leo is ruled by his Sun in Aquarius, and his Sun in Aquarius is ruled by that Saturn in Leo. And so that does add harmony. That is thought to be beneficial, said to be beneficial. And so I wonder if that too is not a part of what predisposed him to a powerful spiritual awakening of a detached nature, of a disidentification with the mind nature, especially with that Aquarius Sun being in a Uranus ruled sign, or just the Sun being in Aquarius to begin with. So that is about it. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else I wanted to go over here. Just sort of scanning through the charts. No, that's it. I mean, I guess I don't think I actually showed his solar arc chart on its own for the time of his awakening. I'll do that now just for the hell of it, in case anyone is curious. Here it is. Doesn't want to focus for some wretched reason. There we go. All right. So that is all we have for our interpretation of Eckhart Tolle's chart, and also our look at the data, the astrological data for the time of his awakening. So hey there, Starlord. Welcome to the stream. So if I were to make some concluding remarks, I guess I would say that, again, I don't think that anything is ultimately outside of astrology. I think that even highly transcendent experiences are mappable, detectable, um, visible through astrology, through transits, secondary progressions, solar arcs, all of it. And as far as the transcendent experience itself goes, look no further than the planet Neptune, and also look no further than the sign of Pisces and what it represents. And as for myself, I will reiterate, how do I view this for myself, and what would I maybe advise for other people? Well, first of all, I'd advise other people to make up their own minds about it. But second of all, um, I would say that if you want to sort of follow my path, well, my path is one of integration. My path is like taking the spiritual transcendent dimension and integrating it with my physical, ego focused life. And so there may be some people who end up watching this who very much live by Eckhart Tolle's teachings and will be a little shocked to hear what I'm about to say, but I don't want to transcend my ego. I don't want to completely disidentify from my mind. I want to have the human experience of being caught up in those things, even if they are ultimately illusory. I want to feel sadness, anger, pain, all of these things. And it's not even that if you are enlightened, you don't feel those. It's simply that you accept them, and then that transmutes the energy, and the feelings just dissipate, basically. That's kind of it in a nutshell. But what I'm saying is, I don't want to have that kind of transcendent experience for my life. I want to have more of like a human life, if that makes sense. But as far as like my ego goes, maybe I don't want to transcend my ego, but I do want to, I guess I would say, master it. And that is where my, I guess, spiritual practices come into play. And it's also where astrology comes into play, I would say, and similar disciplines like tarot, because astrology, if you notice, is a very mental thing. It's like, it is the mind. It's all about the mind. Eckhart Tolle and his teachings are all about transcending the mind, going beyond the mind. But as I've kind of, I've had years to study and think about this by now, I've kind of come to the conclusion, or at least the working theory, that like astrology is like a gateway for the mind into the spiritual realm. I also think that it is a way for the mind to become familiar with spiritual realities and also with integration. So, I don't know. In short, I would say astrology is a great way it might be one of the absolute best ways. It might be the best way to develop yourself spiritually, I guess. So, yeah, that's what I have to say about that. Again, though, for anyone who watches this who wants my advice, do what feels right to you. If you feel like you want to live completely by the teachings of Eckhart Tolle, in his book, The Power of Now, then by all means, go ahead and do so. I would say I would also like caution people, like, be a bit careful, because it can also be a lot at once if you're new to it and start trying to live by that. But if you want to have more of a human experience, as I was describing for myself, then don't shut out teachings like that. No, there's no need to do that. But instead, integrate them into your life. For example, a lot of times when I'm going to fall asleep, I will practice presence. I will practice like feeling the inner energy field of my body and the deliciousness of that. I will practice focusing on the now very intently. I will practice disidentifying from my mind, just observing my mind, you know. And I also practice this stuff regularly throughout the day a lot of times. Like if I'm in the middle of a task that is maybe a bit repetitive and I don't have to like use much mental focus on it, I will just feel the inner energy field of my body. I'll be in the moment. But my distinction between what I'm doing and like what Eckhart Tolle is teaching is I don't try to stay in that state constantly. I want to remain identified with my ego and mind at least part of the time. And yeah, I guess this gets into maybe a sensitive area, a controversial area, because different people are going to have different opinions about this. Some people might say to me, well, how dare you do that? It's negative and destructive, is it not? And I say, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But what about the validity of human experience itself? If we all wanted to transcend, why didn't we just stay in non-physical? And people might say, well, we came here to experience the flowering of consciousness, as Eckhart Tolle calls it. And I say, well, then why do so few people experience that? I say, I just don't accept that theory, I guess. I say that I think human experience is meant to be all kinds of things for all kinds of people, and not everyone is meant to transcend. And maybe some people are meant to transcend through presence, but maybe some people are meant to transcend, and in a sense, transcend through more mental things like astrology. But I suppose I suppose I've talked enough about this for now. That's my perspective on it. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. If you didn't get to see all of it, it'll of course be up on my channel after. And yeah, despite my like differences with Eckhart Tolle's teachings, I still highly recommend his book, The Power of Now. It changed my life in profound and amazing ways. So I highly, highly recommend it, especially if you're done with suffering. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great night or day wherever you are in the world. And I'll see you next time.